Hey guys, this lecture is on theories and causation, and there were so many theories that we had to cover for this module and for this chapter that I decided to break it up into 3 different sections. So for part 1, we're going to talk about why theories are important, psychoneurological theories, and psychodynamic theories. So why are theories important? And I think there's 2 main reasons. First, they provide an understanding of development and the factors that might cause emotional behavior disorders. Second, I think they give us a framework to investigate and research those factors of EBD. And if we can get some really good scientific evidence of factors that affect emotional behavior disorders, then we can develop even more effective interventions. Okay, so let's get into our theories. First, we have psychoneurological theories. And these are theories that assume that the cause of behavior is due to biological reasons. The first type of theories are congenital theories. And these are theories that essentially assume that symptoms are caused by prenatal or perinatal events. An example of this would be hereditary studies. So how likely is it that you will develop schizophrenia if a parent has schizophrenia or if a sibling has schizophrenia? Biochemical theories focus on symptoms caused by neurotransmitters or your diet. For example, people with depression oftentimes have lower levels of serotonin, and serotonin is a neurotransmitter. And what happens, if you guys look at this picture, I know if you haven't had a lot of biology, it might be a little confusing, but neurotransmitters get released from an axon terminal, and they go into this kind of empty space between 2 neurons called the synapse. And they either bind to receptors on the receiving neuron, or they can actually venture out here and get taken back up into the neuron that released them. And a lot of times with serotonin, there's not a lot of serotonin in the synapse, so there's not a lot of serotonin to bind to receptors on the postsynaptic cell, and therefore that person's mood kind of stays down. One treatment for this is to prescribe SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And what those drugs do is they block serotonin from being taken back up into the receiving neuron. And when that is blocked, that results in more serotonin in the synapse and more serotonin to bind to these receptors, which in turn increases the person's mood. Acquired theories deal with symptoms caused by identifiable events, so something like traumatic brain injury or something like that. Now, since all these theories deal with the biological factors in behavior, they take the perspective of a medical model, so all the symptoms are typically treated with medication. Our psychodynamic theories are a little bit different. So psychodynamic theories explain our personal lives in terms of, our personalities, in terms of unconscious psychological processes. And they suggest that childhood experiences are critical in shaping our personality and our development. With psychodynamic theories, there are 3 main ones. There's Freud, Adler's, and Erikson's theories. And today we're just going to talk about Freud and Eriksson. So Freud is probably the best known psychodynamic theorist, and he suggests that children have innate drives and wishes, and how a parent responds to those impacts a child's personality development. Freud and your other psychodynamic theorists suggest that, kind of like I mentioned earlier, your personality develops kind of very early in childhood, and when you get to be an adult, it doesn't really change. So let's talk about Freud. Freud's theories were based off of sex and aggression, so you guys are going to see that play through as we start to talk about Freud's theories of personality development. Freud suggested that we have 3 parts of our personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. And he thinks of this as kind of like an energy system, and energy flows through the id, the ego, and the superego. So it's a very dynamic system, and it's constantly changing, and energy is constantly flowing. So the id is what is present at birth. So when we're first born, our personality solely consists of the id. The id is totally within our unconscious mind, and it works off of the pleasure principle. So the id is immediate, irrational, seeks pleasure, avoids pain, immediate gratification. It wants it, and it wants it now. Now, once we start to interact with the world, we start to develop our ego. And our ego is based off of the reality principle. And basically, the ego tries to rein in the id and starts to control the id. And now the person starts to have just a little more patience and things like that. I see this with my daughter. So I have a daughter who's 1 year old. And when she was first born, when she was hungry, she was screaming. You get that id personality. She's hungry. She wants it now. She wants that immediate gratification. I would be fixing her bottle and she would just be screaming. And after she got, a little bit older, probably after 6 months, maybe even after, I don't know, it's kind of a blur. I can now, when she's hungry, I kind of know. She, in her way, lets me know. And I can fix her bottle, and she waits for it, and she's not just crying. So I start to see that ego kind of take over the id and give her a little more patience while I'm fixing her bottle or her food. The last thing to develop is the superego. And this is when we really start to interact with our world. This is our moralistic component. So our conscious, our moral standards. This is when like I said, you start to interact with the world and the world starts to impose their values and their ideas on you. And the superego is always on the quest for moral perfection. So if you guys ever do anything wrong and you hear this little voice inside your head telling you shouldn't do it, that's your superego. So basically, like I said before, energy is flowing between these three components. And the ego's job is to keep the id and the superego contained, basically. So let's try an example. Okay, so say you guys are going on fall break far, far away from University of Houston, and you start talking to a hot guy or a hot girl. So you're at this party, you start talking to this hot person. What is your id going to say? What is your ego going to say? And what is your superego going to say? So I want you guys to pause and kind of think about what each of these would do in that situation. Okay, so after you guys have thought about it, this is what would typically happen. So your id would say, I want sex now, let's do this. Your ego would say, sex is okay with a willing partner, but maybe we should date a bit first. And your superego would say, no, sex outside of marriage is wrong. So you can see that the id is that immediate gratification, you want it now. The superego is that moral compass, no, sex outside of marriage is wrong. And the ego kind of tries to balance those out. So sex is okay with a willing partner, or sex is okay, but maybe we should date first. So you see that in between. So the ego is really trying to balance itself between the id and the superego. With that being said, remember, I think I mentioned this a couple times, these are systems of energy that Freud describes. So energy is flowing between all three of them. Now, if the energy is all balanced, then everything is good and you are responding to situations in the appropriate way. If energy is not balanced, then that causes anxiety for your ego. And when your ego experiences anxiety, then you engage in defense mechanisms. And Freud has about 12 of them. These are pretty popular within mainstream psychology and just in society in general. So when energy is unbalanced, your ego starts to feel anxiety and engages in these defense mechanisms to reduce that anxiety and kind of restore the balance between the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, Freud also suggests that we go through 5 stages in order to develop into a well-adjusted adult. And parents have to strike a balance between how they respond to kids in each of these stages. If they provide them too much gratification, then there are consequences. If they provide them too little gratification, there are also consequences. So because Freud's theories are based on sex and aggression, he refers to these as psychosexual stages of development. And each stage has what he calls an erogenous zone that gets essentially stimulated. And if you work through these stages and you go through these key tasks that he suggests successfully, then you move on to the next stage. If you have trouble, then he says that you get fixated in a phase. And when you experience anxiety later on in life, well, if you get fixated, it results in adult traits that are not optimal. And then when you experience anxiety when you're older, you go back to that erogenous zone. So for example, the oral stage is first, and the key task is weaning. And so if you go through this and you go through weaning successfully, then you'll move on to the next stage. If you have trouble with weaning, then when you're an adult, you might smoke, you might have a lot of envy, you might be gullible, dependent on other people. And when you experience anxiety later on in life, you'll go back to that erogenous zone, which is the mouth for the oral stage. So if you guys, when you get nervous or full anxiety, if you bite your fingers or suck on something or overeat, then Freud would probably suggest that you have an oral fixation. The second stage is the anal stage. The erogenous zone is the anus, and the key task is potty training. So basically, if you go through potty training, you're successful, then you go to the next stage. If something happens in potty training and it's difficult for you, then that can result in some traits later in life. You can either be really, really orderly and organized, or you can be really, really, really messy. The next stage is the phallic stage. And in this stage, Freud talks about some really weird stuff that doesn't have any type of scientific evidence these days. But basically, he suggests that what we call the Oedipus complex. So boys fall in love with their mom and hate their dad, and girls fall in love with their dad and hate their mom. And these things are overcome when they identify with the same-sex parent. Let's see. And next stage is latency. So in latency, there's actually not an erogenous zone in that your sexuality is suppressed. And this is when you start to expand your social contacts. So, and typically it's the same sex. So, girls will start to have friends that are girls, boys will start to have friends that are boys. This is when girls have cooties and things like that. And then in the genital phase, the erogenous zone goes back to the genitals. But this time it's not your own genitals, it's the opposite sex. So this is when you start to become interested in other people sexually. So those are our psychosexual stages of development. Okay, so like I said before, Freud's theories were based off of sex and aggression. Eriksson brought in the social world into his theories. You're still going to see the same kind of stage-like theories as we move through our personality and development. But Eriksson thought that it wasn't just about sex and aggression, and that the social world had a lot of influence in how we develop. And just like Freud had key tasks in each of his stages, Eriksson has what he calls psychosocial crises. So there's some key crisis that somebody has to go through in each of these stages, but it involves the social world. So that's where you get that psychosocial crisis. All right, so let's look at these. First stage over here is when you're an infant, and this is trust versus mistrust. And basically in the infant world, you're trying to figure out, do you trust your world? Are your needs met? And you turn to your caregiver. So is your caregiver feeding you, giving you comfort, things like that? If they are, you develop trust. If not, you develop mistrust. And if you go through this stage completely, it should result in hope. In the toddler stage, you're looking at autonomy versus shame and doubt. So in the toddler stage, the toddler is trying to establish personal control. So they'll start to want to do things independently. And the parents should, according to Eriksson, let them foster that independence instead of trying to do things for them. If you foster that independence, it'll result in autonomy. And if you don't, it'll result in shame and doubt if you try to always do tasks for your toddler. And I can tell you as a parent, this is really hard. So my little girl, she's technically a toddler, and she wants to do things by herself all the time, like help me unload the dishwasher and things like that. And it can be really frustrating because she's so slow, and she takes out each plate, and I think she's going to drop it, but I know I have to let her do it and just take the time because that fosters her autonomy. But it can be very hard and very challenging. The virtue that results from this phase is will. In the preschool age, you're looking at either initiative or guilt. So in the preschool age, these children are really starting to interact with other children at school. They're starting to play with other children. They're starting to ask a lot of questions. And so if they're really engaged in play and they can go up to other kids and they can play with them and they can make up games and things like that, then they'll develop initiative. They ask a lot of questions, and parents have to be really careful and kind of keep those questions alive and answer them. If they ask a lot of questions and the parents act like they're a nuisance and they don't want to answer the questions, then it results in guilt. And the virtue for this stage is purpose. All right, the next one is a school ager. So this is when they're really starting to look at academic skills. So they're starting to complete math problems. They're starting to read. They probably already read, but they're just learning a bunch of things in this stage, during the school age. And so you either get industry or inferiority. So if you're encouraging their effort and their initiative and their schoolwork and things like that, they develop industry. If not, if teachers kind of don't foster that and make them feel like they shouldn't be asking questions and things like that, then it results in inferiority. When you're in adolescence, you go through identity and role confusion. So this is when you're trying to figure out who you are as a person, what's your identity like, and all those things. And I can remember in high school, we had tons of different groups in our high school. So we had people that were in band, we had the athletes, we had people who did drugs, we had the cheerleaders, we had all these different kind of little cliques and groups. So you're trying to figure out who you are and where you fit in and where your identity is. The next stage is the young adult stage, and this is when if you have figured out who you are, this is when you're more likely to find a person and settle down and have a affiliation and love with another person. If you do, you develop intimacy. If not, you might develop isolation and not really trust in a relationship and find that person. In middle age, this is when you have found your person, you're starting to have kids, and you're starting to give back to society, either through raising your kids or being productive in the community. Maybe you start to join, I don't know, the town hall or something like that. And if you feel like you are contributing to society and you're giving something back, you get generativity. And if you aren't, then you feel really separated from the world and you kind of get that stagnation feeling. And the last stage is an older adult. So this is when you kind of look back at your life. If you feel like you've had a really great life, you contributed to society, you've done some really amazing things, then you have ego integrity. If not, if you look back and think you didn't do anything with your life, then you get feelings of despair. Okay, so we talked about those biological theories, congenital, biochemical, and acquired theories. We talked about Freud, so the id, the ego, and the superego. And we talked about his psychosexual stages of development. And then we talked about Erikson's psychosexual stages of development. So that's it for part 1. Thanks, guys.